So I'm going to be talking about practical uses of virtual reality. And this is one of the really cool things that comes out of the new technology that's available is people can use it in the real world for real things that they would want to use virtual reality for. And they can also use it in real places, whether that's in their home or on the go because it's more convenient and accessible to use where they want and for what they want. Specifically, the work that I'm talking about today is focusing on using natural interaction to normally look at 3D video. 360 video where you can collect data from the real world and have complete freedom to look at what you want. Or for immersive movies. So I don't know how much people have seen these types of immersive videos that have been collected or created by different studios. But there's a good number and a great deal of variety that's come from different types of studios and production companies around the world. So some of these are live action, and they're carefully orchestrated, similar to regular movies, but again, of course, you can look around everywhere. And some of them are 3D, digitally animated. And there's all kinds of different organizations that have done this. Google Spotlight Stories, a well-known one, Oculus Story Studios, been working on this for a while. DreamWorks VR also has been in case people aren't familiar with these, I wanted to show a short video clip just to kind of give an idea of how these work. Usually, you have things going on all around you so you can look around. This is from our Google Spotlight Stories, a video called Special Delivery. So you have some things, if people want to look behind them, you usually have some activity happening, there's different characters and action happening, and it's often up to the person, the viewer, to see what they want to pay attention to and what they don't. Which is really nice. It's really fun because you get to look around and physically turn to see what you want to see when you want to see it. Now, why is it really cool? Of course, it allows a little bit more sense of an immersive, engaging, fun experience because we can add regular physical turning and viewing. But what I'm going to talk about today is really focusing on these other practical cases where you don't necessarily want to be able to have complete full 360-degree view. So these types of cases where if I want to chill out on the couch, maybe I don't want to be turning in circles while I'm lying down on the couch. It's going to be really awkward. Or if I'm sitting on an airplane, maybe that using VR during transit, maybe the people sitting behind me wouldn't appreciate it if I'm turning around looking at them with this wearable display on my face. So are there cases where we can still provide some level of physical turning but prevent this awkwardness? Maybe still allow it, but limit the cases where I might be turned physically in uncomfortable positions, whether it's physically straining or socially awkward for whatever reason. And so the work that I'm presenting here today, we're presenting a very, very simple technique for redirecting viewing in cases of looking at immersive video. And our approach is incredibly simple. We say, is the user physically turned to the side far enough away from whatever the neutral physical position for an extended period of time? Like, how long? That's up for debate. But if they're turned and facing physically, well, we can slowly adjust the view and bring it back to alignment to the physical position to encourage the user to allow them to be able to view what they want, but encourage them to physically rotate and allow them a more comfortable viewing situation. So to try to give a simple representation of this, if we have a physical forward direction, this little blue and purple guy that came from the Google Spotlight story that I just showed previously, over time, if we say, oh, they're looking at this character, and this character isn't moving, it's staying in the same position, I can add some virtual rotation to the entire scene and bring that character slowly over to the forward direction, and now a user is comfortable and facing the same direction. This is not an incredibly new type of idea. A lot of you might be thinking that sounds a lot like a lot of what we do anyway with rotational gains and redirected walking. And it's also very similar to some approaches that is used in motion simulations. This idea of washout filters that has to do with compensating with the physical limitations of motion platforms, where a motion platform can't continuously keep moving in the same direction. So in periods of inactivity, it'll slowly return to the neutral position so that it's ready to simulate future motions. And so this is that's really it. You got it. You got the technique. Now the rest I want to talk about some of the details in terms of how do we make this work and how do we figure out what people think of it. When does it work? When does it not work? The first thing we really need to do to make sure that this can work is make sure that we have a way to stop it. And this is what we don't want. We don't want a person to have to manually control stopping it or not stopping it. We don't want them to have to push a button to cancel it. But we also want to make sure that if a person is freely looking around at whatever they want to look through, that if they make fast motions, we stop any kind of artificial rotational adjustment that we're doing on top of the video. So we've done this in a very, very simple method. No matter what, if the technique is active or not, at any time that there's a fast motion that happens, we say do not apply this technique. If it's in the middle of rotational correction, disable it, stop, just go back to regular viewing until they stop motion for a period of time and then resume. So when we're trying to think about making this technique work, we have a handful of questions in terms of exactly how to do this. What's the exact implementation? What are the parameters we want to do? And specifically, we were thinking about, okay, we talked about physically turned by too much. Well, how much is too much? If they're turned for a long period of time, how long is a long period of time? Do you need to wait for a long time? Do you just want a very short period of time? And then how fast do you want to do the correction? And so this translates to a number of parameters that we allow for a technique that can be configured depending on the different people's preferences. But in terms of an angle threshold, this light blue is just saying this is the forward direction. So if people are physically turned beyond that direction, maybe that's going to be uncomfortable for them. And how long do they want to wait to the side? So we call this our rotation delay parameter for how long we want to keep them looking off beyond that blue period before we trigger the technique. And then, of course, how fast we have to, what's the speed of the rotational adjustment to bring them back to the forward position. So the really nice thing about this approach is it's a very, very simple technique, very, very easy to implement. And because it's entirely based on physical rotation, it's completely independent of what's going on in the immersive video. It doesn't require predefined areas of interest. It doesn't require knowing what's happening in the video. You don't have to make creative sacrifices to your content, to your story, to your digital presentation to make it work. In fact, this can just be done with a simple wrapper on top of a 360 video player that can say, all right, let's do some detection based on physical orientation, look at time, and if we need to, let's add some supplementary rotation to it. So it's a very, very nice, simple solution. What we did with this to try to evaluate how well this approach worked was try to figure out, well, which of these parameters seem most important. Let's try to get a better idea of what are some starting configurations that seem to work very well. We are not looking here to optimize. We're not claiming to say this. What I'm suggesting here is the absolute best way to do this type of technique. But at least we can try to get a better understanding of some recommendations based on what seems to work well and not work so well. So to do this evaluation, we did a user study where we had participants look at 3 digitally animated immersive videos. And we chose these videos. They're publicly available from Google Spotlight Stories. If anyone is interested in these, you can Google it and you'll find it very, very easily. And you can look at these just through YouTube's 360 viewer and play with it, even if you don't want to mess around with a VR version, an immersive version. So we decided to design a study to look at, first off, does it work in terms of correcting people's physical rotation? Does it reduce the amount of physical turning that people do? And we also looked at things in terms of, does this add anything in terms of comfort and sickness? So we did an experiment where we had 18 participants. We used a mixed study design, but the important thing is to note that every participant looked at they viewed 3 of these videos. One of them was a control version where they didn't have the technique applied. And then there were 2 other videos that had different configurations of the technique with different parameters applied to them. For what were these experimental conditions for the variations of the techniques? We looked at a combination of what I call the delay angle threshold along with the time delay for when it activated. And you could think of this in terms of if you're turned to a larger extent, it probably makes sense that it's more uncomfortable and you want a shorter period of time before you are redirected back to the forward. And if it's a small rotational, maybe you can tolerate a bit longer before this kicks in. And then we also looked at the speed. How fast does it rotate you back to the forward? And we played around through pilot testing to try to figure out what are our appropriate speeds. Ultimately, we wanted to try to study something that was on the low end. So we looked at some studies with motion platforms, and we also considered literature and other people's research in this community with the rotational gains to try to figure out what seems to be on the low end and close to what's on the detection thresholds. And this is around 3 degrees per second seemed to be appropriate. And then we also wanted a more aggressive variation that came from some pilot testing to figure out this faster version. So to look at what we found. Overall, we wanted to say, first off, this technique works. It's simple, and it works in terms of what it's supposed to do, which is limiting the amount of physical rotation away from the neutral position. And as you might expect, having a faster rotation is going to significantly decrease the amount of time and the amount of rotation you are away from normal. So it's very, very clear, very, very strong effects to say, yes, this approach works. The most important thing is to also consider, well, is this ruining the experience in any way? So these, we asked some questionnaires about having people rate their experiences in terms of comfort and sickness, and these are based on relative direct comparisons, looking at how did you prefer and rate these different variations that you tried. There is some noise here because of different combinations of the individual videos that people saw, and different videos inherently have a little bit different amounts of motion and activity. But all these videos were, around the same period of time, and they had motion happening all around. And the results were pretty good. The slow variation had very high, this green version, the green bars here, have pretty high ratings in terms of comfort. And the ratings are also still pretty good when you consider sickness. So the red version is the red box here is the control. The green is your slow version. And a high rating here, even on the sickness side, means in terms of concern for sickness, high rating means it's good. High is positive. You will see that we had this blue bar on the far right side is for the fast version. There were some concerns of sickness when you made it too fast. So people don't like too much rotational adjustment. But the slow version worked very, very well. The other question we get when we start talking about this is it distracting to people? Do they notice that it's happening at all? And just a limitation of this work is we didn't carefully really focus on this research question, and we didn't aim to find like a true optimal threshold for detection. But we did want to do some type of evaluation to try to test if this was happening, if people did notice, if they were aware of detection. Now, this is a little bit different than other types of motion and rotation detection studies, because a lot of times when people do these very controlled detection evaluations, you ask them to focus and try to say, do you notice rotation? But here, they're distracted already by the video. They're watching things happen. So you might have a little bit more leeway that they might not notice your other types of visual manipulations because their cognitive resources are already taken up by the other attention. So to do this, after they watched each video, we didn't want to lead participants too much. We asked a sequence of questions to try to give them opportunities to mention anything about weird stuff that would happen in terms of, did you notice anything? Was there anything weird happening with the videos? And overall, people definitely noticed the fast rotation. But surprisingly, just a little bit over a third of the people noticed the slow rotation. So this is pretty promising in terms of not very distracting. It was able to experience this video without really noticing things that were going on too much. So overall, very positive, promising results for this technique. It works, decreases physical rotation, and not very distracting as long as you're using a slow speed to do it. And it's very promising for allowing practical uses of VR for these other types of comfortable, common types of settings where people might want to be sitting down. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to talk to anyone who's interested in hearing more about this.
They have to be quick questions. Regis.
Hey, thanks for the talk, Eric. I'm Regis Copper from Duke University. So the sickness that you, with the fast rotation that led to more sickness, did you counterbalance the presentation? And because the sickness is additive, so people would still feel sick in the follow-up or in the, when they had the worst experience first.
Right. And these ratings are coming from just a direct comparison at the end, just saying rate all of your experiences just relative to each other. in order to, rather than just trying to get a rating after each one as a way to try to avoid those types of confounding effects.
And 13 degrees per second didn't cause people to feel severely sick?
Severely, none of these were severely sick. Yeah, this is really, even though, that's why we weren't looking for just an objective rating, just in terms of compared to each other and compared to the control, how sick. Yeah, but nothing was real bad where people were very uncomfortable.
And you counterbalanced the conditions?
We did a lot of, mostly randomization, but we counterbalanced the conditions for everything that we could, yes.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Tim from the University of Weimar. Could you tell us a little bit more about the selection process of the videos? How comparable were they in terms of length, for example, and
Sure.
also in terms of where the action was happening within these videos?
That's a great question. They're similar, not identical, of course, but at 3.5 to 6 minutes, somewhere in this range, so relatively short. And we did make sure that they all had activity happening where there's things where the characters were moving around, or stuff where you need to follow and make physical rotations throughout. It would be interesting in looking at other types of videos with other types of rotations, rotations of activity happening, and other types of periods of time, for example, that might be fun.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.